Hi friends, Dr. Sunshine here, and today I wanted to talk to you about a topic that is it's difficult to talk about, but that comes up a lot in my practice. I work with a lot of victims of childhood sexual abuse as well as adult sexual abuse. And through the years, I noticed that whenever a person experienced one event, there's usually many more. And they usually lead all the way to childhood. So something starts in childhood and then continues. So I looked at research and I was actually astounded that all the studies show that people who were victimized once are at a very much higher risk to be re-traumatized again at some point, especially with sexual violence, and especially with sexual violence that was perpetrated in childhood. So a lot of my patients say, but that doesn't make sense. If I experience trauma, would it make me more cautious? And actually, it acts the other way around. So I'm just gonna talk about 4 ways why childhood trauma makes you more vulnerable to future trauma, and what steps can you take to start to take charge. So there are several scientific explanations that I wanted to go over with you. One of them is one of the biggest and most common consequences of psychological trauma is emotional numbing, or emotional avoidance. That's the hallmark of PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, and also other trauma-related disorders. That's basically when you numb your emotions due to subconscious fear of them overwhelming you and them being too big, possibly driving you crazy. And also avoiding any emotions or reminders that have to do with the situation where you experienced abuse. So research shows that this actually makes you more vulnerable to not detecting danger in other situations. Just because your senses are more numb, you are less likely to read subtle emotional cues, and you kind of are more likely to miss the danger. And additionally, there's a more severe form of numbing, which is very common in trauma survivors, and we call it dissociation. And that is when the individual at times may lose touch with reality, become unaware of their surroundings. This can happen through a flashback, or this sometimes can happen as a loss of memory episode, where you kind of just lose touch with what's happening around you, and it's just a defense mechanism to deal with the triggers of trauma. Well, dissociation is dangerous because it makes you disoriented, and predators are very much attuned to people who seem more vulnerable, and dissociation definitely makes you more vulnerable. Now, the next one is gonna be a shocker, but it actually has a very good explanation. That hypervigilance, guardedness that you develop when you narrow your social circle and you are distrustful of the motives of others, you use it as a reason to prevent more victimization, and you say, this is gonna help me, I won't trust anybody else, and that's gonna keep me safe. Well, actually, studies show that this exact strategy leads to more victimization, and there is a lot of different explanations for it, but the most common one is that you are constantly on hyper alert, and you are so sensitive to danger cues that over time your body and mind become desensitized to it. So you kind of get used to feeling in danger all the time. So you are less likely to determine when you are actually in real danger, because by that time you probably learned that to kind of tell yourself that intellectually, even though I'm feeling that way, it's probably not true. So that sets you up for misreading the cues of the situation. Another, of course, very common way for re-traumatization is the coping skills that we develop as a result of the trauma. And the earlier that the trauma happens, the more likely you are to develop maladaptive coping skills, such as substance use and sexual acting out. And there are other factors, such as how close the person was to you, how long it continued, and all of that impacts how many and what kind of maladaptive coping skills you develop. And as we know, both substance use and sexual acting out also lead us to put ourselves in dangerous situation and more likely to result in future victimization. Also, substance abuse makes it more difficult to resist and think logically your way out of a situation. So that kind of sets your way up. So another very big reason is that, like I talked in my previous talk about shame. Shame is a very, very common consequence of psychological or sexual or physical trauma, especially in childhood. And I explained some of it in my previous talk about shame. But the reason is, children, we are wired for social and emotional connection to our caregivers. We have to, for our survival, feel that our caregivers have our best interests in mind. So as children, we kind of maneuver the situation in our minds to kind of make ourselves believe that it's not the caregiver, it's us. We deserve what happens. There must be something about us that causes this behavior, but your caregiver really does have your best interests in mind. And we think that way for a long time until hopefully in adulthood you get to challenge those beliefs. But this shame, this feeling of being fundamentally wrong and defected, that leads a lot of people to have very poor self-esteem and to almost feel like they don't deserve to fight. Like whatever happens to them, they deserved it. So they're more likely to have that learned helplessness, and which makes a lot of sense. Some people may believe that their sexuality is all they have to offer, and that's what they do. Some people start to equate love with pain and coercion, and again, that way you seek out, you kind of used to those experiences, and that's what love is for you. So you're more likely to engage in relationships that lead to those things. Also, because of the very poor self-image, you're more likely to feel complimented by the attention of others, and predators usually take advantage of this need for attention. There is another very interesting, very old kind of theory in psychological literature on trauma, and it's called repetition compulsion. It's actually belief that all of us have this innate unconscious drive to unconsciously recreate the situations that are similar to situations where we were abused by our caretakers or adults in childhood, with the idea that this time as an adult you can master it, this time you're gonna win, or this time you're gonna make them love you. That wish, that need never goes away. So it takes lots of therapy and self-reflection to finally understand that that's a futile fight. But a lot of men and women subconsciously get either involved with partners who remind them some way of their perpetrators, or they sometimes behave in ways that I don't want to say provoke, because I never believe in blaming the victim, but recreate some aspects of their childhood traumatic situation in order to master it. And of course you never can, so you just get traumatized more and more. So these are just some reasons, and now I want to just mention some of the ways that you can get out of this. I know that for a lot of you it's extremely difficult to even start thinking about working on that trauma. And a lot of the people I work with usually say, why don't I just let sleeping dogs lie? Why mess with it? Because there is that fear that if you really start digging, something really overwhelming is gonna come up that you're not gonna be able to live through. And you spend years and years stuffing it down. So, however, our defenses do break over time. So it is better that you choose the time that you deal with it than it chooses you. So as always, I advise you get into therapy specifically to address your trauma, and any type of good qualified therapy with mental health professional should be helpful in this regard. But the best evidence-based therapies are the cognitive processing therapy for PTSD. I'll put a reference to it at the in the bottom of this video. CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, helps us process and challenge some of this very unhelpful maladaptive thoughts that we develop about ourselves. Relational therapy is very helpful, where the therapy is focused on your relationship with the therapist, who provides healthy modeling and shows you unconditional acceptance and regard. Also, other very common, very popular and effective therapies are prolonged exposure therapy for trauma. Again, I can talk about it more in other videos if you're interested. I'll put a link again to that, and to see which providers are available. You can search on their websites. So CPT and prolonged exposure are kind of protocol based, shown to be very effective. Then another upcoming star is internal family systems therapy, which is very different, but it tackles trauma issues as well. Then there is somatic experiencing therapy that helps you to deal with trauma in the body. And there's also EDMR, and this one has to do with reprogramming of how you process certain feelings, and helps you release them through eye movement desensitization. I will put a link to that too, so you can learn more about it. And also I attached some resources where you can learn more about all these things that I mentioned and the studies that I mentioned, and also some sites that help you to connect with other trauma survivors, learn skills, find support groups, and sometimes some of them even offer for you to become a speaker for to give voices to those who never got to be heard. And I also want to make sure that I address this trauma, sexual trauma, physical trauma happens to men just as much as women, only it's much harder for men to admit to it. But if you're listening to this and you're a man, I'm telling you that we psychologists, therapists, we know how frequent it is for males to experience it, and how difficult it is to deal with, because it brings up a lot more questions about your identity and your masculinity. So we've heard it all. So please don't hold back. Bring it up with your therapist. So this is my talk for today. If you have any questions, concerns, comments, resources, please post them in the comments section, and I will make sure I'll post all the things that I mentioned at the bottom. And also please hit subscribe to get more relevant videos from me about topics that interest you, and push that little bell notify button so that you get alerted every time I make a new video. Okay, love you guys.